seeing the screen. I may have a note or two on my screen unless I share the screen, correct?
Right, and you want to wait, I guess, to share the screen and introduce whatever you're sharing, like if it comes as a backdrop to a question or something like that before you share your screen.
Okay. There's not much for me to share. I'm just thinking.
So I have 12 noon. Good afternoon and happy Sunday to everyone. Welcome to ADAMA's African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta. Today we are so pleased to have an esteemed group of collectors here with us. ADAMA is a 21st century reimagined art museum. Everywhere we go, there we are. For more information, please visit our website at www.adamatl.org or follow us on Instagram at @Adama_ATL. I'll leave that information up just for a bit. I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Sohei Galbraith of Sohei Solutions. I consult small businesses and creatives in areas of accounting, finance, and organization. My husband, George, and I, he's an artist, and we are budding collectors. And I am so excited to be able to facilitate this conversation amongst a group of giants in the art collecting world. So I will start off with introductions for each of our panelists today. And I will start with Miss Shwanda Roundtree. She's an attorney and independent art consultant. Through her business, Roundtree Art Consulting, she's worked with galleries domestically and internationally. She currently serves as collections committee member of the Ackland Art Museum and professional arts consultant for the Joan Mitchell Foundation. She has been collecting contemporary artwork for nearly 15 years.
Good afternoon, Sohei. I'm happy to be here.
So happy to have you. Next up, we have Mr. Greg Head, purchased his first piece of work over 3 decades ago. It was an Ernie Barnes print, and nearly 20 years ago, his collecting started in earnest as he added works by several internationally known artists. Most recently, he's a graduate of Burnaway's Art Writers Mentorship Program and has written for art magazines like Burnaway, Art ATL, and the International Review of African American Art. He's the CEO of Smart Think Marketing Group, a market research and marketing consultancy, but most importantly, he's the dad to his 2 sons, Garrett and Philip.
Hey, thanks, Sohei. Hello, everyone.
Thank you, Greg. Next, we have Mr. Adrian Woolcock. He's the managing principal of Procidian Consulting. Adrian and his wife have 2 boys, Aaron and Daniel, and as a family, they pursue their passions of art. The collection focuses on images of iconographic women, social realism, the African diaspora experience, religion, and cultural expressions preserved over time.
Good morning. Nice to meet you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Alengo. He's a Cameroonian-born physician and avid art collector who lives here in Atlanta. He has been a collector of contemporary art for over 15 years. He grew up in Cameroon and inherited his love of art from his mother. Dr. Alengo began a modest collection of contemporary African masks in 2002 while in medical school. That collection is mainly traditional Cameroonian masks and contemporary artists has since grown to include pieces from all across the African diaspora from South Africa to Haiti. He resides in Grant Park with his wife and 2 daughters. Welcome,
Hey.
Dr. Alengo.
Hey, nice to meet everybody. Thank you.
So with that, we'll delve right into our questions. And again, just as a budding collector, I'm so excited to be able to facilitate this conversation today. And hopefully I'm going to ask some of the same questions that you all might have out there. So I'll begin, and this question is just for the group, so feel free to answer. Why is it important to you to collect works of artists of the African diaspora?
This is Adrian. Thanks for the question, and thank you as well for inviting me participate in what I consider such an esteemed group of collectors and thought leaders. For me, it's more representational. We feel that the artwork that we surround ourselves in and that we engage in serves as a creation of a curation of our legacy, kind of a reminder of where we've been, and also presents some inspiration and as well as aspiration for the journeys ahead.
And just to piggyback on Adrian's thoughts, all of the arts actually inspire me. I find them transformative. But when you think about the arts of the diaspora, and particularly African-American art, which is what most of my collection is comprised of, it really is kind of grounding and helps me kind of root myself in the history of our people, our story. And even though most of my collection is abstraction, it really is about, our identity, my identity, and it also helps to remind my sons of their identity. And hey, here is a piece of our culture, which we share with friends and others that, again, is a testament to who we are and what we've contributed to the greater canon of art.
I agree. This is Shawanda. I totally agree with Greg and Adrian. Definitely the visuals are extremely important for me to have in my space. And as you know, I have a family too, for the girls to surround themselves by this particular aesthetic. And I'm also drawn to the messages behind the work. I'm drawn to abstraction as well. And I think that abstraction in particular challenges the viewer to, in terms of the thought process behind the work, in terms of coming up with ways to sort of come up with their own way of interpretation, which is, distinctive from figurative work. So it's challenging from that standpoint. And I love to have that type of work in my space.
Thank you, Shawanda.
I found for me the works from home was basically being essentially an expat Cameroonian that lives here is a way of kind of tethering me to the culture that I grew up in. The contemporary part, the masks and the little trinkets. It's just little things that remind me of home, and that was very important to me. I can stare at Picasso all day long, and I most certainly would appreciate the aesthetic. But for me, the color, with African art, it's the colors, it's the scenery, it just reminds me, it just brings me back home. So every time I walk into my house, I feel like I've essentially made a journey.
And so as the collectors have started to touch on a bit, can each of you tell us a little bit about what you collect, what you're most drawn to in terms of medium, artist, and whatnot?
Well, I think as Shawanda mentioned, I'm actually, I won't say torn between two mediums, but if you were at my house, you'd find a lot of abstraction, works on canvas, some on paper, but you'll also find a bit of photography. And so as I kind of moved through my collecting journey, things changed for me. I had two kids. Wasn't able to buy maybe some of the larger pieces that you might see behind me. But yet, because I am a collector, and we might talk about that a little bit more, I needed a shot. I needed something. And so photography was a way for me to continue my collecting journey. But also what you'll find is that a lot of contemporary artists, whether they're photographers or not, are using photography as a medium in which to express themselves. And so I found that really kind of interesting and engaging as well. But back to, I guess, my first love, which is abstraction. When I started, and I think I might be the oldest of the bunch here, and I think you said over 30 years ago, that places me pretty distinctly. I remember growing up seeing signs of, colored and white as a very small child. And so when I think about abstraction, it was kind of, I won't say poo-pooed, but it never got the, it was never, I guess the artists were not lifted up as they were if they were doing something kind of realistic. You kind of knew about Lawrence, you knew about Bearden, but not until recently. have people understood who Norman Lewis was, or Sam Gilliam, or others like that. And so I kind of felt it part of my civil rights crusade to bring these guys to the fore so that people could recognize that, hey, you know what? We've done some stuff that is, very much realistic, painterly, etc. But there are an amazing number of artists who were there with the other artists of the day doing work, but never really recognized.
I think you're right. For us, for me and my family, I was born in New York, but I grew up in Jamaica. I'm a first generation. My wife emulated the journey that my mom took coming to America by being one of the first in her family, and so forth. The journey continues. Ultimately, medium, we typically, you start off and we typically stay within the range of paintings and two-dimensional works, but we do ascribe and we have sculptures in our collection. Installations are a challenge. I know Greg mentioned abstraction. To me, I feel that you become a truly mature collector when you can truly embrace and understand abstraction in its many forms. And we're there in terms of looking to incorporate that in our collection as well. And as you can see behind us is a Juan Logan abstract piece that's very dense in depth of the messages. But for us, the works that we gravitate towards are works that mirror the immigrant experience, both the past, present, and the future, that highlight the struggle, that highlight the many challenges immigrants and the diaspora faces as they try to maintain a bridge to the past, as well as cement their place and presence in the current and the future.
Most of ours is kind of all over the place. There's a lot of masks. I don't know if you guys can see behind me, but there's a lot of masks, a lot of wood. We have a few bronze carvings and sculptures. There's a lot of contemporary art as well. There's some abstract art, but mostly when I look at it and when I stepped back and looked at it, a lot of the masks and a lot of the paintings have we have a lot of things in the collection that are the female form. And that's, I guess, subconsciously, the fact that my mom is such a strong influence in my life, and that's kind of who, I caught this bug from. But my entire family is essentially strong women, and that's what I've always been surrounded by, and that's always. So that's I'm kind of thinking out loud, but I've always wondered what part of it has that, how much of that has to do with why I'm, again, with sculptures and masks and stone, why I keep going back to that African female form. So, but maybe one day a therapist will tell me.
My collection has a number of different mediums as well, from abstraction to figurative works, works on paper, works on canvas, photography as well, sculptural work, and I even have collected video by Sanford Biggers, Jefferson Pender, which was a big leap for me, just because there's so much debate about preservation and how do you hold on to works in a video format. But that's been a joy. Some of the earlier works in my collection were focused on collage. I noticed that when I sort of look back at it. I have work by Wengechi Mutu, several works by Shanique Smith, Nika Shanabare, and those works are sort of in the collage format. Micheline Thomas, and I just noticed that I was really attracted to the colors and all the different elements that go into collage. And so now, just in terms of what I'm trying to do or try to focus on is works that are in a larger format. And so I recently acquired a Makita Ahuja piece that actually was originally in a museum. And the purpose of that was because I find that our work is not really represented properly in the museum forum. And I wanted the opportunity to be able to have works that could potentially be loaned to institutions. That was very important to me. So yeah, so in terms of like looking towards the future, in terms of what I'll continue to collect will be works that are in a larger format. Trying to, for example, one of the works that I was referring to earlier with the Makita Ahuja piece, I don't know if you're able to see it, but this is the original way that I was introduced to the work. And I ended up acquiring the piece on the far right from an auction, the Christie's auction in London, which was very interesting. So yeah, definitely trying to push myself. Here's the work on view in my house now. It's probably about 80 by 70 or so. So larger formatted works.
And I guess I really appreciate, Shawanda, you starting to speak to where you'd like to see your collection go. For any of the other panelists, is there a statement that you want your collection to make? You've kind of thought about, like, if my collection were to say something, what is that? What is that message that you're looking to put out there? Or what do you see for your collection in the future if you have any long-term plans?
I never really thought about that. But I guess it goes back to, just to that last question, which is, I think when somebody steps back and looks at it, they'll very clearly see the influence of the women around me in what I collected, and that's having two daughters. That's a message that I hope that they get from it, is that strength. Yeah.
Greg or Adrian?
I think
For us, there
Adrian.
isn't really a statement. I would consider it more of a story. As we collect an experience, and sometimes we label some of our experiences by the artist, and there's one famous example of a gentleman. He's not a diaspora artist, but his name is Mel Chin. And when my wife and I first came together, we were in Houston, Texas, and we had what we now call a Mel Chin experience. And that experience started with me saying, you have to check this out. And we spent time, and I think, 9 hours later, we're walking out of what was our Mel Chin experience. And we continue to have these experiences with artists and works that inspire us. And now it's becoming these types of experiences with our children. And so the body of work, they're from many different genres that we collect, and it incorporates the ideals and aspirations and desires and likes and messages of my wife, and my two sons, Aaron and Daniel. Some of the names of artists that have been mentioned so far, for instance, Makita Ahuja, I've talked for 10 years to this person. Now, of course, I don't currently own her work, but that's part of the experience. We hope to add that to our collection as well.
And kind of piggybacking again on Adrian, if you look at my collection, it really is a narrative, and it's a personal narrative, and it's been a journey. You mentioned some time ago the first piece that I had. Well, there were actually two pieces we bought, my ex-wife and I together. One was an Ernie Barnes print, Lady in Blue, and the other was Tayo Adenake, a Nigerian artist, and it was called Patience. I have neither of them now. The Lady in Blue went to my dad, and my ex took, Patience, and I guess she deserved it for putting up with me as long as she did. But beyond that, we start to look at, I was a chemistry major, a science major, and I found abstraction very, very fascinating. And so you see most of the larger works in my collection are abstraction, and by abstract artists, such as Norman Lewis, Al Loving, Sam Gilliam, Kevin Cole, and others. And yet there are some turns that we take in life. And so you'll find, other pieces that are more figurative. Hank Willis Thomas, for instance, Sheila Pre Bright, Charles Gaines, Carrie Mae Weems, and even Dawood Bey, because it all tells a story. And I realize that sometimes we tell different stories at different times, and our life is like that. And so for my sons, they are more drawn to the figurative work because they can see it. Behind me on the right, you might see Cinque, which is a Norman Lewis piece. And we talked about that, some time ago, and who Cinque was and what leadership was about and what he did for his people as they, made the trek across the Atlantic. And we expect them to be leaders as well. So there is this sense of uplift and, again, transformation and inspiration that comes from all of the pieces. And so maybe you see that when you see the work. But I guess as an artist would tell me, hey, it's what you see.
Yeah, for me, it's very important to have, for my family and people who come to my home, to have a sense of belonging in terms of the work, or have that feeling of a sense of belonging, meaning that this culture, this arts culture, is something that's normal, that is nothing, that is not sort of an exceptional situation, meaning that this work should be around, our kids just as part of a normal aesthetic. For example, behind me, I have this Nick Cave punching bag, and my 3-year-old is constantly punching it and playing with it. And, there's nothing that's, that should be intimidating in terms of this particular culture. And then sort of looking at putting it into context in terms of how important this is, and how, again, how we're sort of kept out of the loop when we go to the museum space. Is extremely important for us to be able to see the works in the museum. And that, again, it's not something that it's sort of, exceptional from the standpoint of we don't have access to it. So, in my nursery, for example, I have, Yinka Shonibari again, Prince. I have Micheline Thomas works, playful works, I have a Jamia Richmond Edwards piece in the room as well. So I think, when it's all said and done, I want to be able to convey the message that a sense of belonging in terms of the cultural aesthetic.
So I guess there was a lot around a narrative and a story. And Adrian, you touched briefly on an experience with an artist. Do you all have any favorite stories, favorite collector artist stories that you might be able to share?
I do. There was one experience where I mentioned we had a Mel Chin experience, and this artist gave me what he monikered a first day experience. I lived in Washington, D.C., and as usual, when I'm not working and with my family, you're going to find me in an art gallery or somewhere. And in this case, I stumbled in an art gallery in Washington, D.C., and started to look around. And the woman, it was closing time, and she kept it open naturally. And we began to talk. And by the time it was time to go, she said to me, "So who are some of your favorite artists?" And at the time, we were still very early in our journey, and we still are very early in the journey, ultimately, when you think about the broader perspective. And what I started to do at that stage in the journey was give a name. And these are names that you'd read. You kind of read the end of the book. If he or she is in a book, that's the name you're going to throw out as an artist you like. And this woman said, and that led to an experience where she said, anytime you come back, we'd love to have you over our home. And my takeaway is 10, and Daniel is 6. I think Aaron, my oldest, was 2.5 years old. And my wife Tizu and I had an occasion to come back to Washington, D.C. and visit this artist. And it was Sam Gilliam. I visited him and spent time with Ann Gaelic and Mr. Gilliam in his studio. And it was an amazing experience. He gave us what we considered our first day experience. And that was, he graciously allowed us to purchase a piece of artwork at a price that you'll never forget, because he saw how much we were passionate and enjoy and really truly feeling the process. Of course, my wife, being smarter than me, said, "Can we have two?" And we purchased two pieces at that. And of course, everyone was happy. It was a fair deal, but much more fairer for us than him. And at the time, he looked at my son Aaron and picked up a piece of work. He was working on these amazing, dense and rich wood pieces that are painted. And he took it up and cut a piece and signed it to Aaron, love Sam Gilliam. And little Aaron at 2.5 years old is in his stroller. He looked at this red thing and he just kind of threw it. And I had been an athlete. I played football in college, and I just, I didn't play receiver, but I certainly cut that thing. And so that's Aaron's first piece from Sam Gilliam. And that was our first day experience.
Lovely story. Anybody else have a favorite collector collection story?
One of my favorite pieces is when I first started collecting. There's a Cameroonian artist that's called Max Leonga. He's since become like a brother to me. I have most of my collection is actually his stuff. He came here for last year, or no, 2 years ago for an exhibit, and wound up staying with me here in Atlanta. Flew up to DC for the exhibit, came back, and it was so funny because he did, while he was here, he did a whole series. Up until that point, I probably had about 12 to 13 works by him. But when he came here that summer and stayed with me, and unbeknownst to me, while I was at work, he was in the basement and created this entire series of probably about 20 somewhat paintings that he left for me. And he did it. He would do it when my kids are around. And he called it the Freedom Series because when he got the inspiration, he said, from us going down the streets of the Martin Luther King Mausoleum, which he had never been to, which is down the street from my house in Atlanta. And so he created this entire Freedom Series, which is fantastic, and so it's one of the things that I've kind of kept, and that's, I guess my kids will inherit that one day, but it's awesome. I love it. It's essentially helped me to make the downstairs, the basement part of my house is essentially like a mini gallery. So yeah.
Beautiful story.
And I guess my story would be a Kevin Cole story, and Kevin Cole probably anchors a lot of the collection. And it was years ago, and I was first starting as an entrepreneur, and a friend of mine had a couple of works by his. And I wasn't really attracted to abstraction at the time. And I looked on the wall and I'm like, what is that? And he says, oh, it's supposed to be some ties. I said, really? Okay, how much you pay for that? And he told me, and I said, really? You paid that for that? Okay. All right. And somewhere along the road, I had an epiphany, and I went to Kevin's studio, and the first piece I bought, we talked about what all of these things meant. And he talked about the ties were about the struggle and how his grandfather had told him to go under this tree and stand there because Kevin didn't want to go vote. And he stood under this tree and he came back, and his grandfather said, well, how do you feel? And he said, I felt something really weird. And he said, yes, because many men were hung by their neckties on their way to go vote. And that was a way of keeping, blacks from voting in Arkansas back in that day. And so that's a motif that he uses now throughout all of his work. And so again, even though it's abstract, there's meaning to it. But the piece I bought had this odd shaped tie that went to the right. And I was like, well, what's this about? And he says, well, my grandmother said, always do the right thing. And I'm like, that's kind of cool. And I like that. I like the authenticity of it. I love that it was all about trying to do the right thing. And I think, me as a person, we as a people, we really should be about doing the right thing. And so I bought that piece, and then I bought another piece and another piece. And we haven't talked about, the drug of being a collector, but, several pieces later, I've got about 10 or 12 Kevin Coles in the collection.
So, Greg, you brought up Kevin, and Kevin is actually, when I think about our inspiration behind collecting, right? There was the Kinsey collection, there was Kevin Cole, and there was the actual visit to your house. For the panelists, are there any collections or collectors that have inspired you in terms of your collection and what that would look like and kind of the journey you've taken?
Yeah, for me, Peggy Cooper Fritz comes to mind. She ironically reached out to me years after she had a fire in her home, unfortunately, and there had been a Washington Post article about my budding collection. And so she reached out to me during an art opening in Georgetown in DC. And sort of we exchanged information because she wanted to know where my collecting was going in terms of what I was doing. And so we ended up becoming friends, and long story short, I ended up being her buyer. And so her collection was definitely an inspiration, but we inspired each other, which I thought was really cool, just from a standpoint of how Peggy thought in terms of her youthful way of thinking, so to speak, and always supporting up and coming artists. So throughout the years, when I would go to different art fairs and travel, if I would buy something for Peggy, I would end up just the addiction, I would end up buying for myself as well. So I know that she, right before her death, she published a book on her collection. And you'll see if you go throughout the book, there's a number of works that she has in her collection. And I have a work that from the same artist. And so it sort of reminds me of the time that I may have acquired a particular piece for her and ended up buying for myself as well. She was definitely an inspiration to me. And I could just show you a couple of images in terms of, for example, this Nate Lewis piece called Cloaked. I got this piece during Art Basel in Miami and ended up buying two works by this artist, one for Peggy and one for myself.
If you double click on the image, you might expand it a little larger.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Thank you for the tip. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, every time I look at this piece now, I think of Peggy, just because of the collection journey and sort of how we inspired each other from that standpoint. Here's another piece, just in terms of too, like my collection spans from, you know, edition works, which are very accessible to people who otherwise may not be able to purchase, to original works. And both Peggy and I have this work in our collection. There's a number of works that, I'm trying to think of another artist that we may have. Oh yeah, Nina Chanel Abney. This piece is in my collection, and Peggy had a number of works in her collection by Nina as well. And I think also what's inspiring is, you know, when I'm looking as an art consultant, when I'm looking for works for collectors, I'm really inspired by collectors who are novel collectors who are willing to really push themselves during the initial phase. They haven't been collecting for 20, 30 years, but they're willing to really push themselves. So that motivates me as well.
For me, it's not, aside from the fact that the artists themselves inspire me, there's a family that I consider, my wife and family, we consider dear friends, and I call him my mentor in art. And I've never seen a gentleman, he and his wife, that have been so gracious and encouraging and supportive in a very unique way, almost kind of you're always there. And on one occasion, I had an opportunity to buy a piece of work to support the building of the Harvey B. Gantt Center here in Charlotte. And they worked very hard to raise funds for this center. And on purchasing the piece, I made a demand that I wanted this was, I think, a print of Jonathan Green, and I made a demand that I wanted a certain number. And that kind of became a thing I started to do. And his wife said, why do you, why, it's peculiar, why do you ask for that one? And that family and that man and woman is Patrick and Judith Diamond. Patrick and Judith Diamond, amazing people. Some of the first folks that we met here as we moved to Charlotte from Houston. And when we first met them and got involved with the building up of the Gantt Center were some of the first times we participated in an auction. And Patrick, I remember we were looking at something and Patrick tapped me on the shoulder and pointed me in a north by northeastern direction in this room and said, "You ought to look at that piece." And then he just walked away. And that became a friendship and a relationship. He at one point had served on the advisory board of my consulting firm, but more importantly, he's a true friend and mentor, he and his wife, to us, and a supporter of our family. And that's really made a big difference. And it became a foundation of how we've learned. They have an amazing collection of their own, very established artists. And as we bridged from the establishment and the established artists, I remember the ones in the book, as I mentioned, we have started to become more driven towards the contemporary artworks, but still anchored in the classic or the new neoclassic African diaspora artworks.
Greg made an interesting point around the addiction of collecting. Just wanted to kind of go back there a little bit, and Shawanda has also kind of spoken to how that happens. But does anybody else have anything they'd like to share around that? Or Greg, would you like to expand a bit on this addiction that comes with collecting?
So I honestly, one of the questions you kind of set me up with is, how did you know in earnest that you were a collector? When I started hiding work under the bed so that my wife wouldn't see it. And when I started, spending, doing my budget, my monthly budget that included art, at the size of maybe a nice car or an apartment, that was when I knew I had it really, really bad. The flip side or the good side about this is that I had it early. And so I made some really good investments. And while, people say buy what you like, I'll make sure it's an informed like, because some of the pieces that I bought while I was an addict are probably pieces that might help my sons, go through college. And so I'm really pleased that that did happen and that these pieces have grown in value over time. And, I feel good about, those kinds of things. But yes, I, for a long time, needed something in my veins. And so it was either an abstract piece or a photograph or something of that nature.
Part of the addiction for me was always, I've always, it's meeting the artists, right? A lot of times it's, for example, my sister, my younger sister, who's my immediate follower, she lives in Ghana. So she meets the artist and she forms an attachment or a bond with them. And, you kind of, and the same here, it's like when you start communicating with them either on WhatsApp, you form this bond with them. And so they're constantly sending you, right? Every time they do a new series or a new painting, they'll send me images on WhatsApp, and you find that, so you're an addict is when you have to either tell people to stop sending you, or you don't need a hit right now because you just got one. But you form an attachment with the artist, and a lot of times you want them to succeed so bad, and so it's kind of the addiction is part of that. It's like you want them to do well, you want to support them, you want to you see these some of them young, some of them older, and you kind of encourage them and watch them grow, and part of that is like you said, every time you get one of those paintings that are in a series, you kind of want one because they're telling you the story of what they were thinking and how they were feeling with this, when they created this particular series and what their motivations were and what they were trying to convey. And so you feel like if you already have one, it's almost like adopting a twin and adopting one, meeting a set of twins and adopting one and leaving the other one. You know what I mean? You feel like you have to take them both. So.
Yeah, for me, sometimes it's so crucial to get a particular piece because we're kept out of the story a lot in terms of, when I say we, I mean Black collectors of color. And so as a consultant, I get access to some pretty spectacular works that usually, you know, to be honest, are not, you know, offered to us, even though it's by Black artists. You know, usually it's the white male who has the work. And so for me, I found myself in tricky situations where the work is offered and I don't have any clients who are able to purchase the works at that time. And I really have to jump out there and get the work because it's so crucial for, in terms of, you know, being a custodian, that the work be held in a space by a Black collector, to be frank. So yeah, sometimes that drives my addiction, or that push or pull to collect in situations where otherwise I shouldn't be.
Yeah, for me, early in my career, I would consume business books and books about strategy and process, because we're a management consultant. And you start to realize that you have the bug when now what I consume are notes and details and images and knowledge around art and artists. And you find yourself, you start to think about, as the kids grow, needing a bigger house. And certainly the family's needs come first, but then there's always the entire family begins a discussion about, well, also we need to make sure the house can fit the art. And you think about, well, we needed this and we need that for the art. The art becomes another family member. Shawanda, you're truly correct. I spend a lot of time getting to know artists and learning about artists, OCONUS, outside the continental United States, as well as CONUS within the continental United States, learning about them, engaging, introducing. You first start off with, well, go talk to my gallery. And you're going, well, that's not the reason why I reached out to you. I want to learn about you. I want to share who we are. And it opens up an opportunity to build a relationship, which is really important. That relationship capital is extremely important, especially in situations where you may not have the actual capital to finance an acquisition or to fund an acquisition. Again, being fiscally responsible, we have never purchased a piece of work on time, meaning over time. Others have, and that's a good strategy. We growing up in the Caribbean, and even business-wise, you could do accrual-based accounting or cash-based basis accounting. And so our strategy is, if we can't afford it, we're not buying it. And so you wind up in the conversations where you engage, and it becomes a point where the connection is made. And just like I, as a management consultant, wouldn't spend time with a potential client, or Fortune 500 or federal client or what have you, and not expect at least an opportunity to present that which to the marketplace. The artist rightfully needs and requires and thinks, well, okay, well, what's next? And so, trying to manage that and be honest about the fact that you can't buy everything you pick up. And for me, being honest about where we are, and I've had that become a return on investment in being honest, but also being diligent and being enthusiastic about reaching out and wanting to get to know the artist, visiting them, calling them, reminding about their birthdays, hey, happy birthday, sending them notes about things that I thought, or we think that would benefit them. We've had an opportunity to present certain artists that we're trying to build up in first world settings that they may not have gotten into, where I had been the gatekeeper and maybe putting this work at an auction, a benefit auction. We want to get it there. And so, and it pays back in dividends. We've had several artists contact us and say, we really want you guys to have a piece of our work. I really want you guys to have a piece of our work. I want Aaron and Daniel to have this. Of course, and at the right time, they will and they can. So, the bug is there, we're bitten, and all our kids are bitten by it. Now they're artists themselves. The work that they create coming home from school is because of the work that we're surrounded by in our environment. I think Daniel is more a figurative artist and figurative in spirit, and Aaron is more abstractive in spirit and open.
Well, Adrian, thank you for that. Maybe a good time for us to segue based on the relationships that you maintain with the artist. There's a question in our Q&A. It would be great to hear some examples of ways you stay in touch with the local versus international artists that you collect. Do you have any preferred ways of following an artist's journey? Newsletters, phone calls, museum shows, is the question out there from.
I like the personal relationships. I like, getting introduced to them, getting to know them, getting to know about their story. And that's, for me, that's important. So I'm constantly on WhatsApp, and like I said, during the course of, any given day, some of the artists that I know, the kid that I built relationships with, will reach out to the WhatsApp and like, hey doc, how are you doing? Sometimes just to say hi, sometimes just to tell me, listen, I had a new kid, and this is the inspiration for this new series. That personal connection is very important to me.
It truly is. Go ahead, Shawanda.
No. I was just going to say, because I purchase a lot of works from the bigger galleries, the works that I've been able to acquire, for example, works by Yinka Shonibare, the gallery has sort of created an entree to me in terms of being able to keep in touch with Yinka over the years. And I remember years ago, James Cohan Gallery in New York offered a Yinka to me, and it was a large mannequin piece, and it was definitely way outside of my price range, and so I wasn't able to purchase it. But the funny story is, because I love the work so much, I was really sort of focused on and obsessed on making sure that it found a good home. And so I was able to place this piece in a museum by Yinka. It's called Girl on Globe. And I was able to place it in the Corcoran Museum of Art here in DC. And now it's in the permanent collection at the National Gallery of Art. And so over the years, I've been invited to dinners and to lectures by the gallery when Yinka comes to the United States. And so that's just been a joy to be able to keep up with what he's doing and to meet his studio assistants over the years. It's just been a rare opportunity. I've also kept in contact with Victor Ahikaminer, who I started collecting early on in my collecting journey. Even though he's in Nigeria, it's, again, you have rare moments where he may be in the United States working on a project, and I'm able to go and see a lecture or, see his work on view somewhere. So I welcome those types of opportunities where the artists are international, but you still have some access to the work and to the artists themselves.
And one of the things,
we live in a global village of sorts, and when I travel internationally or within the United States, and my wife travels, we always get the business done, and then there's always time for art. And it is important to engage with the advisors that are in the business, the artists themselves, but also the galleries. I've had an opportunity to purchase a Yinka Shonibare piece, for example, and he also had an opportunity to come, I think one of the few, besides the one in Washington, D.C., large-scale sculptures, the installations. Davidson College here in the Carolinas bought that piece. And when he came to the United States, the gallery reached out to me and invited me to come. And it was a wonderful experience because not only did I get to connect with this artist who was extremely surprised that I went all the way to the UK and found this piece of work. It was a print, Love in a Time of War. He was surprised by how we got access to that piece, and it built kind of a leveling. But also we're able to connect with several other artists who are of stature in the area that happen to be there. And it's kind of like you're building this family, this group of friends, that they understand where you are, and you understand that they may be on the list, or you've acquired their work and you care about their success, and you want to live with the global experience of their work and themselves. So I think the best way is to, understand that we're in a global village. There are ways to connect, whether it's via, I think Dr. Elongo mentioned WhatsApp or social media, there shouldn't be an inhibition on being able to communicate and contact someone, and really being honest about your introductions and your intentions.
I also think that when you mention that, the richness for me comes from knowing the artist, or having met the artist, or creating a relationship with the artist, whether it be the artist and myself in isolation or through a gallery. But you mentioned something else, and I might want to just kind of, if you don't mind, just kind of redirect just for a little bit. And you talked about the whole notion of local versus international. I think it's extremely important that we as a people support our local artists. Sometimes the ownership, or the as I call it, ownership of the artist lies with those who don't look like us. And those are the galleries, and they kind of, you know, help the artist get to a certain level, absolutely. But I think there are things that we can do on local level, supporting local artists, that then elevate them. If you look behind Shawanda, you'll see Bethany Collins. Bethany Collins is from Atlanta. And some of us knew her before she was at the Studio Museum of Harlem, and before she was won the Hammonds, not the Hammonds, but the Hudgens Prize.
Right.
That you know, elevated her to another level. There are others here in Atlanta like Masood Olufani and Paul Benjamin, just recent winners of the Hudgens Prize and other prizes. And you know, we have a real important, I think, charge as collectors to make sure that we look toward the next generation of emerging artists, and even those who maybe haven't gotten a shot. And we are the ones that give them that shot, because if it weren't for us, there wouldn't be a Bearden, there wouldn't be a Lawrence, there wouldn't be others. And so we just have to kind of remember that as we go about our collecting journey. And so from a local perspective, I think we can do a lot. From an international perspective, hey, we're kind of getting on board, because these artists have already been vetted by the greater canon, and their investment value is going to be high, and we get them, and hey, you know what? The investment is going to rise. But there has to be some passion with it. We can't collect just by number, or I want that artist, that artist, that artist, but there has to be something that really is salient within us that drives us to collect that artist. Because if we're going to stay with it over time, and if it's not just decorative for a house, you know, matches a couch or something of that nature, and has some real meaning, then there has to be a connect.
Right, I agree. I definitely try to keep up with the artists when they're either straight out of grad school or just starting, you know, their career, and try to support as much as possible. You know, for example, Allison Janae Hamilton, who ended up being a Studio Museum resident. I followed her early on in her journey, and this is a work by her, and was able to support early on, and luckily acquired a work before it became too expensive for my collecting budget, so to speak. She's really big now. But yeah, artists like her, artists like, again, Jamia Richmond Edwards, who I mentioned earlier. This is one of probably like maybe a third or fourth piece in my collection that I acquired early on. Yeah, no, it's very important. Whenever I travel too, whether it's for an art fair or just for vacation, I try to squeeze in a studio visit here and there.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I just love seeing the artists in their organic space, creating. And so, yeah, this, you know, these are opportunities where I'm having access to the work or the artists without the gallery per se being involved, you know, just dealing with local artists. So
there's another question out there, I think that kind of segues from the point you were just making, Shawanda, and the point that Greg made. How do you balance between emerging artists versus more established artists within your collection? And how do you come across those emerging artists? What proactive steps do you take to seek those emerging artists out?
I think you got to for me, you have to go with what speaks to you. You know, trying to mention where do you meet artists, whether it's out of graduate school or undergrad or locally in a newspaper. For me, my local is now formerly Charlotte, but I've lived in many parts of the United States and outside the United States. So my local is somewhat global. But I've had many stories of friends that have, or even friends in the know, or galleries or advisors who, and even the artists themselves who begged me, please buy this. Not because they need it, but they knew that I should have it. And you know, and I've had one of my colleagues, he likes to laugh at me sometimes because on many occasions he's begged me to buy a certain artist that he was certain of because he's involved in the marketplace, and that artist became internationally prominent. But it didn't speak to me. It didn't speak to us. And so whether it's a prominent artist or a local artist or a prominent local artist, if the work doesn't speak to you, and to Greg's point, if it becomes a balance sheet element primarily, then long term, that's not an investment that may last. Maybe you get a return and you get to get a 1x or a multiplier on a sale because it's a balance sheet element. But internally, the purpose of collecting and creating these messages and curating these messages, there's a return on investment that you cannot put on a balance sheet in some senses. And if it's not part of you, you're just doing it because others are doing it, or you saw it on someone else's Instagram. In the end, it's not going to be something, because if it doesn't become the big investment, then you still have to live with it. And if you can't live with it, then you shouldn't have it.
I agree.
Another question that we have out there is just around space demand. So I know in my preliminary conversations with you, and even Greg has mentioned hiding pieces under his bed. How do you balance kind of that artwork and possibly having too much and the space demands that come along with 3D work, 2D work, and getting it all up there?
I've gotten to rotating, you know, like certain pieces on certain accent walls. I'll rotate them. I'm actually in the process of building a space in my house, which will be like this art storage space. And you know,
so building more space for more art.
Correct, correct. And that way, you know, since we've gotten to rotate, I have certain walls that I wrote. There are certain pieces that are kind of like, you know, permanently displayed, but there are certain walls where I'll rotate the pieces every now and then, just depending on the season or just my mood, or just, you know, I see it and I haven't seen it in a while. And so that's kind of how I balance the space demands, because eventually you will run out of room, and I'm getting to that point. And so, yeah, that's another way, you know, it's an addiction when you start considering either purchasing another house solely for the purposes of displaying it, or you know, one of the things that I thought about was we have a condo that I rent out unfurnished, but you know, I thought to myself, well, if I furnished it and put some of my art there and made it more into like an Airbnb rental, which my wife thinks is crazy because she's like, well, what if somebody destroys a piece by accident? But yeah, I mean, you have to get innovative, because you do run out of room pretty quickly.
Yeah, I rotate a lot. I rotate, one, because I definitely run out of space. Two, because it may be a work that I don't want my toddler to have access to. But also I rotate work just for preservation purposes, to make sure that there's not too much sunlight getting to the work, for example. I recently rotated my Carrie Mae Weems, which I love, this piece here, just because it's delicate. It's a photograph, and I don't want it exposed to too much light. Yeah, sculptural work, I definitely rotate that depending on what's going on in my house. In terms of making way or room for more work, I have loaned works formally, and also loaned works to trusted family members like my mom. You know, as long as there's a strong understanding of, you know, how to preserve the work, and that there's insurance coverage for the work, I don't have a problem with it. So,
yeah, we've loaned works to museums, and sometimes you kind of wish maybe they can keep it for a little longer. because you take it off the wall and they package it and they take it to the place, and you put something else up and you're going, what am I going to do now? You know, there is always a space concern. We do fortunately have a little bit of space, and not yet under the mattress, but we do have a storage that we put works in. But then there's, you know, once it's up, and there's a cost to getting it up, of course, depending on how high. You know, once it's up, the challenge is the rotating of it. So what we try to do is, you know, in certain areas where there's a lot of light in our homes, we maybe put a film on the window so that UV protection, in addition to the framing of it, of the work. If it's not framed, there's UV protection in the home and certain lights. And you know, one thing we try to do, you know, when the kids play with Nerf guns around the house, and their in-laws, the cousins come, they can shoot each other, but they can't shoot art. That's the main rule, because it's out and they live with it every day, and even in their rooms. And so I think the question is, where do you run out of space, and what do you do? We have had a conversation, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, that we're, as you know, once in the past, when looking for a new house, we thought about the needs of the family. And I think either one of the kids or probably me and other people said, well, we also need to account for where we're going to put the art. So I don't think you can ever solve for that challenge.
I would say ditto to both, to everyone, because when I was married, I had a bit more art, as you can imagine. And the house we lived in was the house that I felt, you know, kind of best displayed the art. You know, there was art on one floor and it was of this genre, and the other floor was this, and it had a basement level, and that became works on paper. And so I felt like I had my own personal mini museum for quite some time. Then I downsized. And so it was like, okay, the large pieces I need space for, because I'm not going to store them. And I want to make sure that they are safe and secure. And so I looked for a house that could meet my art needs. And I didn't think it was really odd. It was just kind of something, you know, as a collector, I did. Now, there are tons of works in the basement that probably won't get seen very often, because the pieces that are up for a reason. But to Shawanda's point, I've got photography in a room that's pretty dark, and photography is very, very fragile. Some of the other pieces I try to rotate into my son's room, but they also have their own aesthetic. And they say, no, Dad, we don't really want that piece. Okay, well, pick what you want, and you know, I'll find other places for the other pieces. But it's you know, just one of those things that goes along with having a collection, whether it be 5 pieces, 15 pieces, or 500 pieces.
You know, Shawanda mentioned the kids. Again, we have kids, and there have been discussions about not necessarily where to store it, because if you buy it, you have to have it has a place in your home. But there have been discussions about, well, is this the kind of work that we need our kids to be seeing? Not many pieces are like that, but you know, the Robert Colescotts of the world, and you kind of say, well, you know, we bought that thing, and others have seen it. It's in a book and what have you. And so the compromise was, let's place that piece at an offsite property or location that they'll see it, but it's not an everyday thing. You know, because certainly you don't want our kids to see Robert Colescott's work as a normal, given the themes.
Yeah. Or there's a young lady I bought recently by the name of Ife Williams, and she does ceramics. And my sons are into soccer, and it's all testosterone in the house. And so the soccer ball gets kicked around, and they know if the soccer ball is anywhere near a piece of art, that's a real problem for them. But I also know that I can't have any sculpture at a certain level or on a certain floor. And so it's kind of moved into different rooms and different places, because while they've grown up with the art, they have grown up. And there's a little more force with the balls, and a little more force as we, you know, wrestle and play around the house.
So it's slightly beyond 1 o'clock and is with all of the wonderful ADAMA Salon conversations. They've extended beyond just because the conversation has been so great and robust. But if I could get some final thoughts or words of encouragement, especially for budding collectors. So I think as folks were reaching out, especially within the Q&A, there's some questions around, you know, should I collect prints, or how do I get started? How do I make sure I'm not intimidated? But if you had any words of wisdom, things that you may have told your younger self as a collector. So whether that's 15 years ago when you started, 30 years ago, Greg, when you started, if there was something that you didn't know then, but you do know now, that you could share, just as final thoughts for all the panelists.
As a closing statement, I'd say read all that you can read. Lima Taha has a great book on collecting African-American art. There are other things that you can get, other books that you can get and read. And buy what you like, but again, have an informed like. Know who you're buying, know what it is you're buying, and you can find a lot of deals. And you don't have to have an amazing budget to have an amazing collection.
I 100% agree. I would say, you know, start off with what you like. My first couple of pieces were just things that kind of spoke to me, things that I liked. You find different artists, you know, you obviously tailor to your budget. I was never going into it to become a collector, you know, per se. I also never planned on reselling anything that I bought.
Right.
That I've bought. So it's the question is, what does this speak to? What does this say to me? And this is something that I know I'm going to own for life, because there's, you know, I don't ever see myself turning around and kind of selling a piece. I'll loan them out, but I'm not selling anybody anything in my collection.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. The relationship capital and the capital of honesty and earnestness in reaching out to the artist, or reaching out to the places where the art that speaks to you exists, whether it's from the artist, from the gallery, from an advisor, from a broker, from a marketer, is important. Reading and learning, like anything else, you know, one has to be passionate about everything that in their life and that they're passionate about. And when you're passionate, it follows through with what you spend time with. There's a more articulate way to say that, but you know, you can tell what you're passionate about by what you spend time with. And for me, certainly it's family and business and art. Constantly, you don't have to spend money to learn. Not in this day and age. You don't have to spend money to engage, and you don't have to spend money to be honest. And so, you know, with those things, you can engage with artists and artwork that speaks to you, and access and start to begin to collect work that builds your collection the way based on what you're capable of and the way you want to build it. And finally, there's no comparison to anyone else's collection. You don't know someone else's journey or their path and their presence. You know, we don't keep up with the Joneses. I keep up with the Adrians and the Tizus and the Aarons and Daniels. And those are people in my family. We chase excellence by our standards and not others, and everything. And so my point is, the minute you decide to try to build something like someone else did, you're already on the wrong path. The minute you decide that it's solely about commerce, you're on the wrong path, because you're not a stock picker, and it doesn't work like that. You have to combine all of the best. As Greg said, it's an informed buy, but it has to be a passioned informed buy.
Yeah, I always advise my clients to have a budget, because I think the intimidation factor is always sort of there for new collectors, and that's sort of where my focus is, you know, novel collectors. And so, you know, having a budget in mind sort of provides focus. It could be a situation where you have a certain pot of money and there's this one piece that would be the best shot for acquiring a work versus trying to acquire 10 works, you know, in a year. So, you know, being strategic with the budget, and ultimately having work in your space that you absolutely cannot live without.
That's right.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of the panelists. it was truly an honor to kind of be able to sit at your feet and facilitate this conversation that I would have been more than happy to have simply just been able to witness. So thank you all for allowing us to partake with you today. It's been an amazing Sunday, an amazing conversation. The Sunday Art Salon conversations are every Sunday at 12 noon. So please be sure to follow ADAMA on IG. Also, if you go to adamatl.org, you can subscribe to our mailing list so that you're aware of kind of what other programming may be offered. Next Sunday's conversation, Mother's Day, is going to be a beautiful one featuring all female artists. So hope that you can join us for that. But again, thank you to the panelists and thank you to ADAMA for creating and providing this platform of conversation.
Thank you, Asohe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really, really, really good. So much great information. And I'm over here like, okay, let me make sure to send out my latest PDF to everybody. You know, shameless plug, shameless plug.
Yeah. I thought it was great that Shawanda thought to share works, and I didn't want to get into a technical snag, but we did have some things. I don't know if you can attach it to a future to the video, if you so care to, some works that we thought we'd share from our collection. But I thought that enriched the conversation, as you know, she was able to bring out actual works and express the point of view that way, visually as well as ocular.
Yeah, that would be great. If you want to send any images that you would like, I will. In fact, a couple people have asked for me to put a sort of reading list together from this conversation. As you guys were talking real time, whenever you would drop the name of an artist, I would put a link to their work in the chat. And so people have asked for an archiving of that information so that they can refer back to it. So any images that you want to share, I can also add that to it as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Fahamu, were you able to save the chat?
Yes, the chat, all of that information is archived by Zoom. It records everything.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right, so thank you guys. This was really great. You know, it's a beautiful day. I'm pretty sure it's really nice there in Charlotte. It's like super nice here in Atlanta. And from the view from what I can see from your window, Shawanda, it looks like it's nice there. So I'll let you guys get to your day. But thank you again for your participation. We really, really sincerely appreciate it. And Asohe, you did a wonderful job. Thank you.
You did a great job, Asohe. Thank you.
It's so nice to meet all of you guys.
Nice to meet you too, to meet you like in real life, in person soon.
Yeah. Take care.
Well, maybe, Shawanda, you can solve this coronavirus thing so we can get to these places we need to go.
I'd be rich. Take care, you guys.
All right, bye.